Hello.
Hello.
Tonight, we're going to be talking about my career inquiry project that I do with my juniors. It is a quarter-long study into one career. As I go through what all the project entails for both the instructor and the students, I've got some questions that we can talk about and discuss as far as what you do in your classroom currently, or what you could do in addition to something like this for each of the steps that we go through. Some things you might not have tried before, and hopefully you come out of this with some new ideas to try out and test with some of your students going forward. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about how it began. This started the first year that I started teaching in Washburn. I teach 7th, 8th, 9th, and 11th grade English in Washburn this year. I've taught all of the grades except for the seniors since I started there, and a fair amount of the seniors at the school will take college comp their senior year. And so I wanted to put together some sort of project for the juniors, since they weren't going to be taking senior English, to get them to start thinking about what careers they wanted to go into and have time to actually study that career. I also wanted to provide a project that was closer in the demands and the rigor of a college class for the students who were looking to take college comp the next year, so they had a better idea of what to expect. When I originally started the project, it was an informative project, just informing me about the career. I found out that the senior teacher there did something similar. I only did that for 1 year, so then the next year I collaborated with my library media specialist, and during our PLC time, we came up with some amendments to the project, kind of actually just redid the entire project for the most part into primarily an argumentative piece instead of an informative piece. And when we collaborated, it really was beneficial not only for me and what I wanted to get this students to get out of this project, but it was also really nice for the library media specialists, because through this project that we put together, we were able to not only hit English language arts standards, but also North Dakota library and technology standards. She was able to get in front of the juniors and give a presentation about research and touch on some of the things that were more difficult for her to get in front of an entire class of students with a significant amount of time to cover things. Also, it provided means for her to talk about interlibrary loan and get kids to use the North Dakota State Library and use her more in general. So that was one thing that through this really was unexpected, but a pleasant addition to this project. And so that's where I want to pause and give it to you first of all, is I just want us to think and maybe ask ourselves, how do you collaborate right now with your library media specialist?
Well, I can answer for the university level. teach composition classes, and we rely on the librarians to come and talk to our students about how to use the different databases at our university's library, how to access reliable resources, and how to differentiate between untrustworthy sources and not. So they are used to doing that kind of instruction for us, and we are used to having them come and help us with all of our writing classes for that reason.
That's great. That's exactly what she goes over with our students as well when she comes into the classroom, shows them what the databases look like, how to search for things using the different types of language for search terms, and how to make their works cited a little bit easier, because through those databases they usually provide a slew of citing standards, MLA, APA, Chicago, all of those, and they already have the citations made up for the students. So it's a matter of just copying and pasting rather than going through the whole process of having to cite it on your own, which students like very much, having to just copy and paste that. Anyone else do anything presently with their library media specialists?
We actually don't have one at our small school. So some of the things that you just mentioned, we go over with them as classroom teachers, how to find reliable sources. We talk about plagiarism, how to properly quote sources within their research papers. But we do have a bookmobile that comes around if they need any resources from the Bismarck or Mandan and surrounding libraries.
Sure, yes. You know, our school just took a hit with that this year, and our library media specialist is now our preschool teacher full time now. She used to do double duty, 50-50 with the preschool, 50-50 with in the library, and now she's just on that side. So I know exactly how that feels to lose a really great resource like that. Luckily, she's so helpful in providing that feedback for students if they want to reach out for her. But I understand when it's a smaller school that it's harder to provide that access for students. Another resource that I offer students, well, I used to offer students because our school isn't subscribed to it anymore, but if your school is, TutorND is a good resource for students. They can upload their papers and share directly with a tutor who can give them feedback in general on the piece, or they can ask them specific questions or specific parts of the essay to look at in particular. Another thing that I would really like to implement more and even require it for the project is to have the students interview somebody within the field that they pick for their chosen career. Right now, it's just not feasible for me to require it, although I do highly stress the benefits of it, being that it's a primary source of information, but also that they can help analyze other information that the students find on their own. And also they can provide what the field is actually like right now. What are things that are going on within the field, what is being debated, or what concerns are in the field right now from their perspective. Has anyone provided access to experts for interviews before in their classrooms? And how did you contact them if you did?
I haven't contacted them, but I know that Bobcat in Bismarck has a program specifically for, I believe it's 7th and 8th graders, to come into their building and practice engineering practices with STEM and things like that, and they talk about their careers. I thought that was kind of a cool idea.
Yeah, they have a really great facility in Bismarck. to provide plenty of space for students to come in and see everything. I was in there for robotics for our scrimmages and things like that. And I know the Lego League also has a lot of events at that center. So that's a really great resource for those types of careers. Now, it'd be nice if they all wanted to become teachers, because then we would have plenty of people for them to interview, but that isn't always the case. The next thing that I do with the students for this particular project is I use contract grading rather than traditional grading. They sign a contract that, as long as they keep to all of the elements of the contract, they will receive at least a B for the quarter. And I found the benefits for this to be that it keeps them accountable. It puts more of the duties and timeline of things on the students. It also eases struggling writers who, as we go through this process, and there are a lot of other smaller writings that they do along the way, that they don't feel like they're going to be scrutinized for every single piece of writing that they produce, and that it'll just be looking at their final product. And that helps them. It also helps slower workers who are worried about feeling rushed to get things done. Students who can produce quality writing, it just takes them a little longer, and so those deadlines are easier to meet when they know that as long as they meet weekly deadlines or bi-weekly deadlines, it's easier to keep everything together for them if they're a little bit slower. And also it makes grading the ancillary pieces quicker, because I'm just looking for really a bullet point of, did they include these things, more so than scrutinizing the quality of how they did the smaller pieces, and knowing that it's really the final products that will be graded per se, I guess. Has anyone tried implementing contract grading into their classroom? Nikki said she hasn't herself, but that she had a professor once who did it, and as a student she liked it and she would be willing to give it a shot. Anyone else? Kevin, do you see very many college instructors implementing this sort of grading system at DSU?
I can't think of it. As soon as you said that, I couldn't think of any professors who told me that they do that. Although it's one of the things that we teach future teachers when they're, taking classes to become teachers. We talk to them about that as an assessment option. I just don't know of any professors who are doing it.
Sure. Okay, some of the types of writing that are produced throughout this project are proposals, source analysis. I wouldn't call it an annotated bibliography per se. It's something close to that. They have an informational piece on their career, and they also have an argumentative piece on the career that they choose. The timeline, and this is malleable a little bit. I like the idea of, oh, it's a quarter long, but depending on when you implement it, the school might have ACT, which for juniors, which I want to leave a little time for practicing some ACT skills. Sometimes you have state assessments that they have to take, and just general students being gone for sports and all of that stuff. But here is a rough 9-week timeline that I try to stick to here. The first week and a half, we just, in general, review the research process, and there's a quiz at the end of that week and a half. Then we spend a week working on their first proposal. And that proposal is a general proposal of their career inquiry and the proposal for the informative piece that they will put together. Then they spend about 2 weeks working on the informative piece. Now, if they get done with the proposal sooner than a week, then that just gives them more time to work on the informative piece itself. Within that 2 weeks, at the very beginning of that 2 weeks, we will also have a conference between me and each of the students, going over their proposal and what to look forward to next. After the informative piece is due, then they will work on a second proposal, and that proposal is for their argumentative piece. They'll have 2 weeks to work on their first draft of that argumentative piece. Now, I say first draft because really it's the first draft that I'm going to be looking at. If they want to have me look at what would technically be their second draft, and they want to do a little bit of revising or editing to it before I actually look at it the first time, you know, that's fine. I really just mean the first draft that I look at, and that's due after we conference about that second proposal. That first draft is due, and then we will have a conference over that draft, and I will give them feedback on that, and then they will have about a week and a half to really go through and polish everything up, revise it through one more time, edit it one more time, and then after that week and a half, then they will submit it. And that's the basic timeline for all of those major writing pieces that they will produce. What I ask you is, what time frames do you usually give for your various writing assignments? What kind of time frames?
I could tell you for my composition classes, it's between 3 and 4 weeks per essay.
Okay. Do you give a length requirement at all with those?
Yeah, a word requirement for each essay. So the first essay from composition 1 to the last essay of composition 2, they've just grown over time.
Sure.
So not pages, but I guess by the end, their essays are 10 to 12 pages. And by the beginning of comp 1, their essays might have been 5 to 6 to 7 pages.
Nikki said it's usually multiple weeks for her because in part it takes her a while to give decent feedback, and definitely found that to be the case. And that's why we conference over that first draft, so that I can give them quality feedback, and then let them go through and really apply that feedback to that final piece. Because what are they going to do with it when I give them feedback on their final draft? They're going to say, oh yeah, I guess you're right, and then not really apply it to anything, probably, especially since this is the last thing usually that they do as juniors in my class. So there isn't really much turnaround time for them to apply that feedback. So if you give that feedback on one of the earlier drafts, then the expectation is they have time to implement that feedback in their writing. The research process overview, we go over what the steps for researching are, talking about credible sources, using note cards, practicing paraphrasing, summarizing, and embedding quotes into their writing. Constructing claims and arguments and a working thesis. This is one that we usually spend more time on out of all of these. They tend to have difficulty coming up with a claim out of nothing. They're always like, well, what do you want me to write about? Well, you know, what do you, and so getting them over that hurdle of, this is something that you are coming up with, from scratch, or at least from the research that you in particular have done. I haven't done the research, so I don't know exactly what can be said about it. That is something that takes them a little bit to overcome. We talk about body paragraphs, strategies for intro and conclusion. What part of the research process do your students struggle with the most?
My class always struggles with the finding valid reasons to prove their claim, or they have a thesis or a claim and then they have to give valid reasons and explain it further with hard evidence. They find it hard not to keep repeating themselves. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's probably the hardest part for them.
One thing that helps me with giving them feedback for being less repetitive in their explanation and in their analysis of their findings is to provide them with sentence frames or sentence templates within the paragraphs. You know, this shows, or this because of this, or things like that, that move from just quoting and saying, and this is why this shows, but actually explaining, you know, why. You can find different sentence templates out there that help move students to that more analytical piece. That's something that I see them struggling with as well. As they find their sources, we use Noodle Tools in our school as a digital note-taking resource to keep track of all their sources, to make digital note cards and keep them all together. Very handy tool if your school has the means to acquire that. But when they find a source, and it's like, this is a source that I'm intending on using in my either my informative piece or my argumentative piece, I have them fill out a critical notes sheet, and that I got from a conference where Jim Burke spoke at. I also have them fill out a Leo form, which comes from the book Making Curriculum Pop by Brian Goebel, and he actually spoke at an NDCTE conference 3 or 4 years ago. And he's got these great one-page worksheets that make you look at a source through different lenses, whether they be analytical lens, although it's all analytical, but through different creative means to look at a piece. And then for sources, I have them, they're required to find physical books, online sources, and also multimedia sources. So whether that be the interview or the maybe podcasts or a video from some source, something that's also not just a text-based source. Has anyone used Noodle Tools before? Yeah, it's a web-based, basically digital project tracker, and you can compile and find and cite all of your sources through there. It keeps a works cited, and it always adds to it as you add sources. And so when they get to the point where they need to print off their works cited, you just export it and then copy and paste it onto your paper, and they keep it up to date to MLA 8 if that's what you use. And so it's a very handy thing for students who are prone to not being the most organized. The only issue is if students want to work on it at home and they don't have internet access, that can be a hindrance to them. But I always allow them to use physical note cards too, if that's something that they would prefer. Talking a little bit about the proposal that they have to write, these are all of the sections that they need to include within their proposals. They need to tell me what the subject of study is, what is the career field that they're choosing, and I want them to try and be as specific as possible that they know of at that point. You know, maybe a student wants to go into welding, but they don't know what type, then they could just say welding in general. And maybe they know what type of welding they want to go into specifically, or what types, and so then they would want to be as specific as they know at that present time. I want them to provide some questions that they have about that career in general, and these are going to be kind of the basis for starting their research when they start looking for sources. Rationale, which gives them the opportunity to explain what brought you to this topic, why this particular field. Provide some predictions of what they'll find, the importance of this study, who cares about this particular field, what are you planning to take with you, and what might a reader take from this piece. Research methods and mediums, how I want them to think about how are they going to go about finding their sources. Are they going to use the library media specialists? Are they going to use the databases? Are they just going to use Google? What are they going to use? And do they have any intention on trying to find a video or an interview or something like that? Headings, I want them to think about and plan out at this point, what are all of the sections of their career that they are going to talk about specifically for the informative piece. Are you going to talk about what skills you need for that career, what sort of education you need for that career, what that career is like, what sort of tasks they complete on a daily basis, what's the pay for it? All of these types of sections under that field in general to inform and show their knowledge of that career through this research. And then I also want them to provide a timeline for that piece. There's a proposal for the informative piece and a proposal for the argumentative piece. So I want them to give themselves a goal of, you know, maybe by this date I want to have X many sources found, or I want to complete X many critical note sheets or things like that, so that they can have a plan set so they're not aimless in their day-to-day workings. For the informational piece, I provide them 4 options on how to present that information. They can present it in a conventional informative research paper. They can present it with images through an infographic. They can present it in a series of podcasts where they might, for each heading, provide a 4 to 5 minute audio podcast about that particular part of the career, and then put them all together. Or also, and this one's a newer idea, is a poster series where they put together, instead of just one long infographic, separate posters for each section that provide on more detailed information under that section. And I tried to pick these particular pieces because I feel that the learning curve, the technological learning curve on the infographic, the poster, the podcast, are relatively minimal. And so I thought of, oh, well, they could do a video or something like that. But then you have the struggle of, well, how much time are they focusing on how to put it together rather than how to gather the sources so that they have quality information. I want the information, I want the career to be the focus of this, not the technological part. Well, let's talk about the argumentative piece. This one, I do require it to be a written essay. And the topic for this piece is some sort of debatable, concerning, or controversial topic within the field. So this topic is really only going to come out of substantial research within that field to see what is going on presently, what is something that they potentially will have to deal with as they go into that field. The essay itself, how I structure it, generally I have just used a conventional sort of 5-paragraph with an extra opposition paragraph structure, but I recently have been looking into the fun-sized academic writing for serious learning from Gretchen Burnaby and Judith Reimer. Lisa Guzwell presented a couple weeks ago and talked about this text, and it was something that interested me, and so I've looked into it. I've been using it in a couple of my classes, and so there are some structures in there that I think would help the students with at least just structuring the essay. Some of the ones who struggle with how to organize. So that's another thing that I'm looking at doing. I haven't done it before because I just started looking at this book this year. We talked about this a little bit, but my question for you is, and I'll preface it with saying, when I student taught, one of the discussions that I observed within the English department of that school is talking about certain length requirements of their essays based on the grade level. So my question is do your schools set any grade level minimum requirements for research papers or essays or other long form writings?
We do at our school. Since single teachers have several grades, we usually do a paragraph per grade. For example, 8th graders have 8 paragraphs, 7th graders have 7, 6th graders have 6, and so on. And where this really comes into play collaboratively is we do some type of fair every single year. Think science fair. One year we did a reading fair, and we just kind of switch it up. And the whole school has to write some sort of paper, if you will, from kindergarten all the way to 8th grade. And so that's kind of how we differentiate there.
And you've liked that model?
It works well for us. It helps the students who struggle, because the ones who are naturally fluent writers will take it way over the top anyway, but it at least gives a base for the students when they go to research and things like that on how much information they need or how descriptive they need to be or things like that.
Sure.
And then obviously the younger grades are way more teacher-led than the older grades are.
And providing that increase even from such a lower grade level helps them know what to expect, right? Anyone else have grade level set minimum expectations for their papers or essays or whatever you call them? We talked about the word count as a minimum requirement.
I think the paragraph per grade is a good idea as well. It's kind of a similar thing. It's an arbitrary choice that just forces students to write more. And so it's kind of the, the parallel to saying, well, here's an arbitrary number of words, make sure you get that. But I can share with you, I have some colleagues who will do this with their argumentative writing assignments. They will say you must use X number of sources and then lower the number of pages. You have to say more in less. I think they do it in part to teach concision. Don't ramble too much. What can you say in fewer words? But it's probably also practical. Like at the end of the semester, how many essays they have coming at them, they don't want too many extra pages. But I just thought that was an interesting idea to share. You might think of that too. Some of you might want that as a way to amp up the content of the paper, but reduce the number of pages you have to read. Minimum number of resources, but then minimize the number of pages.
That's essentially what I have been doing with this particular project, is require a number of sources and loosely require a page number. It's kind of naturally fell to, on average, students will get about 3 to 4 pages for a decent one, and closer to 5 or 6 for a solid one based on the rubric that they're given. We have 3 teacher conferences during this process. We go through the writing that is in question, whether it's a conference on one of the proposals or on the first draft that I'm looking at for their argumentative piece. Then we talk about what they need to do next. And then if they have any questions, I'll go through that. I don't have a formal conference for the informative piece. I generally find that the 2 weeks that they have to work on this part, they're asking questions enough throughout that that we don't really need to conference after the fact. They can just get on their next piece. Also, because it is informative, there isn't really too much as much of analysis on that one, so it's more straightforward. How or when do you implement teacher conferences with your students?
I can share what I do right before their final draft. So they write 4 or 5 drafts of each essay. Right before the final draft gets submitted, then they have conferences. And we have an on-campus tutoring center, an online tutoring service, and then me. And I split each of my classes into thirds and rotate them. So I'll see a third of them for each essay, a third of them will go to tutors, a third of them will use the online tutoring. And then over the course of the semester, I will have seen everybody for conferences and they will have tried 2 different types of tutoring. But I do that right before the final draft.
Anyone else implement conferences with the students, either about their writing or about their reading? I know we've talked in the past about conferences on your independent reading. Okay, Nikki shared that one of her colleagues does conferencing in class and also makes screencasts with comments on their drafts as a way to give them feedback. A little bit on revising and editing their papers as they go. We use a lot of ratiocination worksheets in my English classes, and this project is not any different. We have a process of revising and editing that uses color coding for each section of the writing. They need to highlight or identify different parts of the writing when revising for each section. They need to identify their editing marks for various editing. And I'll structure this in general, usually with the grammar standards of that grade level. So I'll emphasize, verbals with the 8th or 9th grade or whatever is in the standard for that grade level, whatever grammar, I'll focus on that one in their editing so that they're seeing it and seeing that they're trying to use it in their writing correctly. They will staple the copies of their essay that have colored pencil marks all over them to their final draft, so that I can also look and see, what changes they have made throughout their drafts. I also use a couple different acronyms for revising and editing. For revising, I use the acronym ARMS, add, remove, move, and substitute. I tell them, I say, you can't write well without ARMS. And they always say, well, you can't write at all. And I said, well, it's not so much, some people have mastered the art of writing with their feet if they need to, but that's why I qualify with you can't write well without ARMS in revising your work. And then COPS for editing: capitalization, organization, punctuation, and spelling. So a couple different acronyms to help students think about how to improve their writing. I use Turnitin for them to submit their papers. It's nice for the students because they can see the percentage of their writing that is quoted material. And so I tell them we want to try and keep that percentage down to about 10 to 15%. They can also see how well they are paraphrasing or summarizing or incorporating those quotes into their writing. When they submit their final draft, I look at it both for the quote percentage, but also for potential plagiarism. By the time they're submitting their final draft, they can submit it as many times as they want before the final draft, but when they're submitting the final draft and I take a look at the Turnitin report, that's where I can take a look at who unfortunately has tried to plagiarize part of their work. So my question here is, how do you handle plagiarism in your classroom or your school?
We try to front load a lot, teach them ways to paraphrase appropriately, find good sources, talk about exactly what plagiarism is, and that we will find it even if they try to think that we won't. And so we just try and talk about it a lot up front.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never had a problem with it, but I also have a small amount of students each year, so it hasn't been an issue for me.
Anybody else use Turnitin at all for students to submit their work?
I have before, and now our university is using Blackboard as the learning management system, and Blackboard has a Turnitin component just called Safe Assign. So I do
Okay.
use that on the final drafts. And like you said, the students then can also see if they've inadvertently plagiarized or not cited something properly, as well as if they can see that I can see if they advertently did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd be surprised though what students will think, oh, well, I'll still get away with it. Assessments and grades. So I talked about how I use contract grading here. There are assignments that I will give grades to. There are assignments that I'll give completion points for. The quiz is graded. The critical notes and Leo assignments are submitted as they're completed. There's not a particular hard deadline except for the deadline of that writing piece. They need a minimum of 4 per writing piece. They need to do a critical notes and a Leo form for each source. And then they need to contact me as they finish their note cards for each source, so that I can review them with them. And so that'll be an unofficial conference time where we look through their note cards, and as you talked about before, front loading that, paraphrasing, summarizing, incorporating quotes in your writing well ahead of time before it becomes a problem down the road. We also provide a rubric for the informative piece and a rubric for the argumentative piece that they have access to throughout the entire project. And then the first draft that I look at of the argumentative piece needs to be completed on time to keep in line with the contract. So overall, in putting together this project, I want to provide a few different things for these students. I want to provide them with substantial time to really investigate a career of interest. We talk about in education where it just seems like there isn't enough time for things. So I've tried to provide different enough pieces of writing and different enough activities to do all under the same topical component so that they have a substantial inquiry into their career. Provide an experience not dissimilar to a college setting, and at least maybe in the rigor and expectations of that for those students who are planning to take college comp as seniors, so they have an idea of what to expect. Provide a creative means and a traditional means of communication. That informative piece can have not just a traditional research paper, but then they also do need to provide one of those with their argumentative piece. and also provide a setting where students can generate their own claims, which I said earlier is something that a lot of students struggle with, because everything beforehand is, and maybe not in English class, because I certainly try to provide that opportunity well before just their junior year, but also across other content areas. It's so much more teacher driven in here's what I want you to do, or this is the way that I want you to think about it, and things like that. So my question to you here is, in what ways do you provide any of these outcomes to your students, if you do at all? Hopefully you're thinking of ways to do that if you don't already. Does anyone provide any sort of means for these outcomes presently?
I kind of want to talk on the at the bottom where it says a setting where students generate their own claims. One of the ways I challenge my students in their argumentative writing is I give them a topic, like school uniforms, for instance. Should students have to wear school uniforms? And if my entire class or a majority of my class is in favor of yes, they should, I make them argue why they should not, or whatever side they are not taking. I make them find claims and argue against their actual reasoning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, really
Okay.
a good idea to make them think about the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, to help them understand why potentially they do think the way they do.
Right. And for me, it's to get them to find proven facts and sources and things like that, because I usually let them work together and I argue their side. And so then it's very hard for them to argue against me, and they have to work really hard for it because they usually agree, you know, because I'm arguing their opinion. So that's usually kind of fun.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Well, that is all I have this evening. I've put it to you if you have any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, or ideas about the project or the topic of investigating a career or a particular topic. Just any feedback before we close up? We got a couple of minutes if anybody wants to share.
Could you tell us briefly how you manage the conferences that you do with students in the classroom? How does that work out? During what time? What are the other students doing? That kind of thing.
Sure. Students are always going to be, once their proposal is due, then the expectation is that they start working on whatever the next piece is. After their first proposal is due, they need to start working on their informative piece. After the second proposal is due, they need to start working on their argumentative piece. After their draft that they submit to me, the first one that I look at is due, the expectation would be that they start the revising and editing process on their own with those color-coded worksheets. So they're always going to be doing something. I set it up to meet with them within a week or so in class, but I also open it up to students who want to meet outside of class on that contract that we go over at the very beginning. I provide all of the times that I'm available, especially during the spring. A lot of students end up being gone for softball or baseball or track or speech or whatever it might be. And so if they know they're going to be gone in a particular time, they can always schedule to meet with me during my prep or during homeroom or doing before or after school. So that's kind of how I try to schedule the conferences with them.
Just want to thank you, Josh, for leading this conversation and guiding us through a topic that's really important and really interesting. And if anybody has any questions or comments or anything that you think of later, please don't hesitate to reach out to Josh or send it to me, and I can make sure Josh gets it And again, I thank everybody for spending an hour with us tonight, and wish you all the best rest of the week.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you everyone for listening.